As much as I'd like to say I'm feeling Heishou fatigue, the fact that we've either drugged or killed 11 units in this mirror world, and then the 2 newest furries give proper sinking to Dawn and burn to Heath, screw it. Let's go whole hog! Shove an Ox Bolus in Merceau, give him a new charge unit, and complete the zoo. I mean, since Lei Hang isn't counted in this world, we'd finally get to see if having a full 12 center faction's worth the hype. Because somehow, Spherical Dawn absolutely is. Heishou, Dawn, and Heathcliff are a special bunch in that if you know anything about playing a Heishou ID, they're nothing too new. But the fact they get along super well with both the H-Corp factions and at least one other makes it pretty easy to tell if they're worth pulling for. So TLDR, Dawn's worth it if you got the Wuthering Butlers, and especially if the Coffin Collector's among them. And Heathcliff is worth it if you've got a solid burn team, with Liu Yi's Song being a solid counterpart for him. And of course, you can find a place for either of these if you got about 5 Heishou units, including the One-Eyed Despot. But if you want to know how to play him, well, we'll need to start with the GOAT. Heishou Pack Waybranch Don Quixote is a rupture sinking unit that, despite what it looks like, wants nothing more than to invent new ways for enemies to have the most painful mental crash possible. And if you don't believe me, then let's take a look at her Sin passive Explosive Battering Ram. This passive is a laundry list of all the ways she can deal more damage to an enemy, including being at negative SP, having rinking on the target, simply not having SP in the first place, and gets an extra buff when she's in Ram mode, aka Burgeoning of Horns, which yes, is her designated Heishou buff status. For this passive, BOH will allow her to deal more damage on the last coin of her base skills, and all the more so if the person she's fighting can't even muster up the energy to go on the offense. There's even a bonus to Clash Power if the enemy has a clashable guard, which means hooray! We've got another Dawn that was built for Patricide! Now, despite having a passive that has 5 different damage buff clauses, the main statuses you'll be managing with this ID are Shattermark and the mentioned Burgeoning of Horns. While we'll get to Shattermark later, BOH here will increase the amount of rupture and sinking potency that Dawn will inflict, almost certainly by 1 going off of her Heishou Kindred, and gives buffs to most of her skills. Plus, since it reduces in stack every turn, this status acts more as a temporary buff to her than a resource to manage. So think of it similar to the Mao Pack Strider Mao statuses, because just like Otis and Ryoshu, this Dawn earns her horns with her Clashable counter and skill 3. I Shall Crush All That Standeth in Our Way is a clashable counter that gains final power based on rinking, applies rinking potency, and will provide likely 3 BOH on the next turn. Again, I say 3 because that matches with every other Heishou's own buff. And following that vein, her skill 3 has its own special brain breaker of a status. Crushing Horns is a Gloom 4-coin skill that, like all of her skills, gains coin power based on rinking. And just like the Shortest Irishman, will become unbreakable and deal more damage if she's got BOH, and gain it if she doesn't. The coins will apply Rinking PNC, and the final coin has a funny damage buff pulled straight out of W. Heath's kit, like what the Desaturated Domestics deal out on the daily. Will deal slash damage based on the coin's final damage, and will deal all the more if the enemy's got Shattermark. Oh, and right, this coin will also inflict Shattermark the next turn if the unit doesn't have it already. If I didn't know better, I think this is PM testing out a new meta for sinking. Shattermark is a debuff effect that, similar to Echoes of the Manor, changes the victim's panic type, if at all possible, and drops the enemy's clash power if they're not really the panicking type. But to those that are so inclined, they'll lose both clash power and defense level to varying degrees at low morale and panic. As always, obligatory defense level down to fragile conversion. Aside from that, this Brain Blast status will also cause the enemy to take more damage from Gluttony and Gloom. And if I had to guess, this would be anywhere from 10 to 20%, which for being active on 2 sins would make for a safe placement on either a Heishou or a sinking team. But as we all know, all good things must come to an end, and that includes trauma. So this status will lose a stack at the end of every turn. Considering the fact that this unit is the first to directly empower her skills based on the enemy having potentially several panic type changing effects, it's starting to make me wonder if we should see this be Sinking's new Deathmark or Tremor type going forward, since Sinking's currently the status that's most due for an overhaul despite Walpurgis's efforts. But hey, we can always hold out hope. Maybe we'll see it and Burn get a buff in the Infanticide season. But back onto Ram Dawn, Ron for short. Her final 2 skills are simple, but still look promising. Her S2, Seize the Momentum, Shatter the Wall, beyond sounding like a bootleg L-Corp slogan, has buffed coin power with Rinking, turns the final coin of the skill unbreakable when she's got BOH, and the coins will inflict Rinking PNC and a similar bonus to slash damage on the final coin to what the skill 3 does. So more than anything, this is a skill that pays off the most by both having her Sin passive and her BOH on deck. But then we've got some potential in this skill 1, Breakthrough. While the move is mostly milquetoast, as a ranking P and C applier, it's the only skill that gets a flat buff if the enemy has Shattermark. And in my head, this buff goes one of two ways. Either it's a constellation buff so her lust skill isn't left out when her other Gloom and Gluttony skills get a buff from Shattermark, or it's absurdly powerful and is meant to be the intended tool for attacking any enemy with Shattermark. Either way, I'm gonna be a very surprised and happy camper if this thing gets a 50% damage buff or more. And rounding Sheep Dawn, Sean for short, out, we've got two final passes. Lament of the Lost Sheep is her obligatory Lord of Hongyan Hong Lu synergy, which will give him the ability to inflict sinking every time he inflicts Rupture, and that means they finally did it. With the power of 5 different statuses, this Hong Lu has the means to match Race Song and debuff application. I don't think that's really relevant to the kit, I just think it means Kim Ji-hoon has a favorite child. But thankfully, Sean Quixote also gets a buff since she gets her horns out if Hongul decides to swap her into the fight. And poisonally, that's enough for me to suggest keeping her on the bench as the first or second backup slot in a Heishou team. But hey, if that isn't enough to convince you, her support passive flesh-rending horn growth makes a solid case for what the Heishous like to do. The fastest ally will apply defense level down onto enemies that have enough ranking count. While not the best passive in general, it's tailor-made to this team enough that she'll find a solid place as a midliner and a respectable frontliner in a sinking team. However, I'm sure y'all would prefer a visual on how she works once she's out in the field. So, let's hit up the vision board. As I mentioned before, this ID is very beat by beat similar to the early Heishou units we had. Because of that, unless she has abnormally bad clashing, she should be very easy to win rate with. But if you want to play strategically, the first priority is to get that BOH on deck, especially since it buffs her skill's final coins. And the easiest way for her to do that is through her counter. But if for some reason you gotta get some hits in first or just want Fawn Quixote to come out the gate dashing, you can also insta-grow those horns by using Lord of Hongyan Hong Lu's counter to swap her in. And funnily enough, swapping her in with Kongul's counter will also proc her skill 3, which will get you through phase 2, applying Shattermark onto the enemy so there's a designated target to work with. Again, turn economy, baby! But if you're gonna do it manually, then you'll just take an extra turn or two to break the dam. But once that wall's cracked, you wanna seize that opportunity ASAP with phase 3. This is where you can deal the most damage with this unit and even get a bonus with the SP damage and immense clash power of Dawn's Fluid Sac, or just throw in another S3 if you get the chance. Then once you've had your fun and the statuses run dry, you can do it all again by returning to phase 1. Rinse, repeat, regret. And speaking of regrets, how about we go over what could ruin her vision? As always, there's the ever-present bad clashes and bad status application risks every ID has, but I think this Dawn in particular is gonna have a hard time being count neutral with any of her skills. Rupture and Sinking are the two statuses that care the most about count economy, and she doesn't have a lot of coins that apply either. In order for either status to be positive, or in Rupture's case, neutral, each instance would need to apply an average of 3 count to make that happen. And I know IDs have experienced power creep over the years, but those are still some tall thresholds for her to carry her weight in that regard. Because of that, a Heishou team is likely to only want her to take part incidentally rather than as a mainstay, even if she looks better off than you, Sinclair, or either of the C IDs. And while a sinking team will find greater use with her, if her Shattermark only applies 2 count, like how Wild Hunt Heathcliff's Ruin does, it could get tricky for her to make good use of her optimal window. Overall, if you've got a sinking team, I'd call her a solid get. But if you're gonna get her for the Heishou team, she's on the mid-low priority list since she's neither a main Rupture bringer or an adept. But if you really are jonesing for getting a cute sheep ID and a Don Quixote with a custom animation, then yeah, by all means, take her. Now on the other hand, the new Heathcliff ID is looking very much like a trailblazer, and not just because he's the man's first burn unit. Heishou Pack U Branch Adept Heathcliff is a burn Rupture ID that's shaping up to be a direct upgrade of you, Sinclair, as he should. This ID's mainstay status is his Battle Blood Instinct, which will up his damage output in haste based on the stack. And the way he gets it is broken down beautifully in his Sin passive Bloody Storm Blight. KF Cliff will gain Battle Blood Instinct whenever he starts a clash, hits with a non-ego skill, gets a kill, or when he takes any burn damage or takes a fat chunk of burn damage. So unless any per turn cap is downright oppressive, he'll be able to gain 5 of it each turn and possibly more. This pass will also up his offense and defense level based on how much HP he's missing, which is the trademark of the U branch. Though before we go any further, I should mention that while I feel like these calls on the different kit reviews have been mostly hits, like Damn, listen, I feel like I've earned the right to flex a little and say it really is possible to read into these kits without the numbers and get a solid ballpark on quality. But I also gotta admit, Hugh Sinclair is the one I missed the mark the most on. His whole deal was that he had SP healing and buffs from max SP and heads hits, and those were something I put way too much stock in being good. And in the end, he was about as lukewarm as any idea you could get without having to pull. So cause of that, we're gonna use his kit as a way to get a better read on what to expect with Chicken Run Heath here. As such, I'd like to start this breakdown by explaining how the U-Pack work in general. The U-Branch Heishou are basically H-Corp's Shi units. They build a lot of power out of being at low health or based on however much HP they've lost over the fight, as well as both inflicting and receiving burn with their skills. And their signature status Blood Flame is there to up their SP on stagger and kill, which really helps with units that are always living on the edge and get a lot of heads hit buffs. But when you put all of this together, what you get is a faction that's very capable of reaching their peak power fast, but will struggle with a long drawn-out fight since they're getting ever closer to death and will absolutely get there with 1-5%. So what exactly is it that Project Moon did to improve on this glass cannon concept? That's easy. They gave the Brit the same death defiance his handler has. Not only is Heathcliff immune to stagger or death by burn damage, but Flame Rooster's Death Defiance is Hot Wings Heathcliff's innate passive that'll stop him from dying and then give him a heal based on the amount of burn he has before stripping that all away. Now, while removing burn in some ways is a downside to this ability, it's a great panic button and way to prolong his own kind of wild hunt. And the best part is, this ain't even his most useful heal. We'll just get there in due time. Instead, let's move on to his Heishou starter, More Grub for Us. This is a clashable counter that is the main way to give him Blood Flame, here's a reminder for those that need it, and will give Heathcliff some burn count while applying Rupture count and burn potency on the enemy. This counter has 3 other effects that are common across all of his other skills, being buffed by Rupture, and dealing more damage based on the cumulative HP he's lost. Speaking of, Sinclair's buff from cumulative HP loss capped out at 30% and needed him to lose 90% of what he had. So while I doubt we should expect this buff to be super powerful, anywhere from 30 to 60% feels reasonable, especially since the man knows how to lick his wounds. Now, onto his offense skills, which in addition to the Rupture coin power buffs, will get stronger when our favorite Bongi wielder has burn, low HP or Blood Flame, will apply burn P and C to the target and himself, and also have their best effects on their final coin. First off, there's the skill 1, Peckham, which inflicts Rupture potency, with the second coin also inflicting Rupture count on heads hit. Easily the simplest of the bunch. The skill 2, Mutilating Talons, inflicts Rupture P and C, but has a special condition on the final coin that'll deal extra wrath damage to the enemy on hit based on how strong the coin was and how much burn he has. And if you're either lucky or mentally well enough to hit with heads and either have low HP or Blood Flame, then you can reuse the coin to proc the effect again. Oh, and on that note, both Sinclair and the Blood Flame Sword mention getting a similar buff while at less than 50% HP. So since this trait looks more like a U-branch condition than a Heathcliff one, this is a good sign that you should be able to proc most of Heathcliff's HP limiting effects without needing to be at much less than half health. So hey, the more you know. Then we've got the Meteor skills, starting with the skill 3, Blood Flame Massacre. Like with Sinclair, this beauty has unfocused volley, meaning that our boy's gonna be swinging wildly at random from a pool of 3-4 saps. The skill will also give him Blood Flame, but having Blood Flame already will turn all 4 coins into UBs, which is great since their effects are pretty damn good and don't need to be uncracked to proc. All 3 of the first coins will add burn to himself and the target by default, and cause the human bucket filler to proc burn damage on himself, helping him get below that 50% threshold. Finally, the last coin will inflict Rupture count and make like the S2, and this time deal gluttony damage against all 3 targets based on the coin's damage and how much burn he and the original fella he was clashing with had. Overall, it's a great midpoint skill to both pay off some of Heathcliff's setup, but also act as a way to buff him too. Because if you remember, just about everything these skills do will help with building up that battle blood instinct. And with enough, that unlocks the skill 3-2, Rooster's Rampaging Blades under the Ensanguinated Heaven. Dear God, that is an LCE Yi-Song style mouthful. This skill's similar to the original skill 3, except with UBs on deck by default, deals more damage based on how low both his and his target's HP are, gives him burn on clash win, and will inflict Rupture P and C all around, spreading it 1 coin at a time. And of course, the final coin has its own effects, which basically combine the skill 2 and skill 3's effects, both reusing the coin and applying a fraction of its final damage to all the targets. But most importantly, the final use of the coin will heal Heathcliff by the amount of the effect damage dealt, and then remove some of his self-burn after the attack to heal him further, stopping him from falling into the death cycle that you, Sinclair, was destined to have. And while this does come at the cost of all of his Battle Blood instinct, that just means this is a pretty common loop and that you'll have to pause in between getting access to that heal again, which considering his playstyle, he's not gonna want to use to recover often anyway. And lastly, Heathcliff's Game Foul passive will allow Honglu's crusty eyeballs to deal some extra wrath damage when he uses a Gluttony skill, and his support passive, Balked Against a River, what the fuck was that, hello, will let an ally with the least health get Clash power up next turn if they're low enough. Now, if you ask me, both of these effects are kind of crock shit in comparison to the rest of the ID, but hey, I'm glad I can say he's better fielded than dead or in the backline like Sinclair was. So now, who's ready to staple a chicken tender to a corkboard? Since Heathcliff's best end state is built up on a variety of factors, the best place to start is with his most core resources that help him function. That means his first priority is to gain Battle Blood Instinct and SP, as well as apply Burn on himself. Thankfully, it just so happens that all of his skills are able to meet at least 1 or 2 of these requirements. But like with Goat Dawn, gone for short, you can have Confucius chuck him out to get a head start on all 3 of these. Then, once you've gotten him to 30 or higher SB, with some burn, you can move on to phase 2. And while the game plan is similar, this phase is about getting the large throbbing Cluck to half health and however much BI he needs to use his skill 3 too. Very simple, very win rateable. Once that happens, you'll move to phase 3, which is even more simple. Just get in there and inflict the fucking curse of the Colonel on your enemies. Let that skill 3-2 rip and then go back to phase 2 to rebuild your BI to set him up again. Such is the endless cycle of violence he thirsts for. And speaking of things that are wet, let's take a look at what could dump some cold water on this Firebird. God, I love Dispatch. Well, past the obligatories, I can safely say that this ID isn't terribly hampered by not having a lot of rupture count application. Would it be nice? Oh yeah, sure. But since he's a more burn-focused unit, count isn't as hard to manage and he has a ton of procs for potency, meaning even the numbers being on the lower end won't be a deal breaker. Now, what could be a problem is if he needs a ton of Battle Blood Instinct to proc the skill 3-2, or if the cap on how much he can get is too low. If it's up to 30 like the Blood Fiend Carnies, it takes more than 4 turns on average for him to get access to his ult, that's gonna hurt. In addition, since this ID is separated from Sinclair due to the fact that he can heal, if the extra damage from his skill 3-2 is low, or if the Death Defiance isn't able to heal him up to at least 30%, that's gonna be much less of a boon and lifesaver to him. The damage being low will also mean it's less rewarding to get that skill 3-2 in the first place. But thankfully, you, Sinclair, has a similar effect on his skill 3 that says it's 20% damage. And if the healing is at least that much, he shouldn't have any problems. As for a team comp, I'd actually put him right above Wei Dawn in the hierarchy solely because while he's an adept, he's not a rupture adept like Faust or has synergy with another strong unit like Heisong. But even if I'm not fielding him for the Refraction Railway, yeah, he's definitely taking one of the Mao Heishou spots in a team of 7. But on the other hand, if he's on a burn team, he fits a similar role to LCE Faust, except he'll stay on the field for longer, and he really likes being around Liu Yisong since he's just such a great help at maintaining SP. Ego-wise, Heathy doesn't have a perfect fit, but his Zaiins feel like the biggest choice you'll make since this ID fuels them both. And while Holiday is handy since Heath will often have burn and proc its passive, I personally lean towards Body Sack more since it fits in with getting buffs and more power on kill. But that's about all I got. I hope it gives y'all a sense of whether you want to pull, and if you want to guarantee that you'll be seeing chicken of some kind this Wednesday, I'll be streaming the RR1 Bokgak when it comes out and trying to not eat 100 chicken nuggets. It's what I think is one of the best ideas for a challenge I've ever done, where every turn on the railway I eat a chicken nugget, meaning that either I'll be getting good at this game fast or getting food poisoning faster. And I don't know about you, but I can't think of a better way to spend. And now, on to the member and patron Q&A. Alright, today's question comes from Cat's T Photos, who asks, have you read any of the Sinner's source material books yet? And if not, do you plan on doing so? I have actually read The Metamorphosis. That was something I read in school, and I'll be real, I probably wouldn't have read it otherwise. It's a fine book. I'm glad I read it. I'm glad I get the references. But as far as planning to read the other books, probably not unless it's for videos. Now that said, I am going to be reading Hellscreen really soon, and at least one, if not two, other related works, just for the sake of understanding Heishou. And I guess I did actually read the Odyssey, now that I think about it, though that was so long ago I can barely remember it. So, But as for anything else, nah. I'm pretty barren on the source material stuff, and honestly, that is fine.